All right, I am Chris Reed, Deputy Editor of the San Diego Union-Tribune Editorial Board. We are interviewing City Council President Sean Elo-Rivera on the occasion of his running for re-election. We can do some brief intros now, even though everybody's known. On to you, other Deputy Editor.
I'm Laura Castañeda, the other Deputy Editor.
Hi, I'm Tania Navarro, Community Opinion Editor.
Okay, Councilmember Elo-Rivera, will start by asking you to give the 90-second version of why you think you deserve another term that you give to people when you run into them in elevators.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, Laura and Tanya. I think that for the past 3.5 years, I've demonstrated myself to be an effective fighter for San Diegans. We came into office during the height of the pandemic, kept San Diegans pretty safe during that time, worked really hard to keep people in their homes. Obviously, that hasn't fully worked, but we did pull in $218 million in federal emergency housing assistance to keep people housed. And through my leadership at the council, we've established programs that have been effective in preventing homelessness and keeping people housed. And they need more investment. Our job isn't done yet. Obviously, there's still a lot more work to do. And the last thing I would say is I am focusing on the issues that are impacting the majority of my district, which is 60 to 70% renters and lives below the area, the region's median income. We're fighting to reduce cost of living. We're fighting to make sure housing costs level off and come down. And it's important that the folks who sit in these seats have the policymaking ability, the political acumen to be successful in City Hall, to be a counterweight to the mayor. And I think I've demonstrated that through my time on council so far.
Okay, on fiscal issues, the city council passed a $2.15 billion general fund budget in June, and there was a lot of patting on the back because it was a unanimous vote, and the mayor sold it as a sound way to get the city back to firm ground. But analysts said that it requires voters approving a sales tax hike in November to pencil out, and maybe also down the line a future parcel tax. Does City Hall's fiscal health require San Diego voters to accept higher taxes?
Well, if they want to have the infrastructure that I think San Diegans want and deserve, if they want the sort of services that they want, then yes. And Chris, I don't like saying that. I'm running for re-election. There's no politician who would open a handbook on how to run for office and hear, do it while you're saying we should raise taxes. But I refuse to continue the dishonesty that City Hall has had with San Diego voters about what it costs to run a big city. And that doesn't mean that every decision we make is perfect, but there have been structural imbalances in our budget for decades. And those have been pointed out to us from independent budget analysts. And one-time tricks to fix structural budget deficits don't work over the long term. They're irresponsible. And they leave us in positions like we're in now, where we have multi-billion-dollar backlogs for infrastructure. Those did not show up overnight. Those showed up over generations of deferred maintenance, of kicking the can down the road. And I'm not going to do that anymore. So I don't like having a conversation with constituents, but I feel like it's important. And I'll just use one more example. The things that folks expect: their potholes to be filled, their streetlights to work. They know that it costs money to do that work. It's not an incredibly challenging conversation when you actually have it to tell folks, look, here's what's happened in the past. Here's why we got to where we are. Here's why we had 30 to 40% vacancies in certain departments, and why it took so long to get those streetlights back on. We need staff to do that work. We need the financial capability to procure the equipment to do that work. I think folks understand that whether it's a household or a business or a city, a certain level of revenue is needed to operate at a decent level. And for way too long, San Diego's political leaders have refused to have that conversation, and it's left us in a position where we have no choice but to increase revenue.
Okay, now I completely get that argument. However, there are many, many people in San Diego who would say the people who make this argument would have far more credibility if at some point they did attempt to control city spending in a meaningful way. And I will offer this with a very specific reference. There have been so many studies over the years by think tanks that say that the efficiencies that the productivity revolution brought in the 1990s to the U.S. economy never made it to the public sector. There have been, the McKinsey think tank said that, for example, virtually all white collar jobs could be consolidated if the private sector policies were followed in the public sector. And now we've got AI coming on. But we also have the advent immediately of public sector unions saying AI will not cost us a single job going forward because that's not why government exists. Most people don't think government exists to provide jobs. They think government exists to provide services. So what do you say to the argument that your point, it's dishonest for city residents to expect services without paying more taxes? What about the argument that, well, it's not honest for government officials to pay more taxes when they don't take basic measures that have been taken in the private sector for decades to reduce basic costs on things that can be automated?
Well, I'd say that alone would not fix the structural budget deficit. And Chris, I understand the argument that, well, until you're doing everything that you can possibly do, but that will inevitably and has already led us down a path of not meeting folks' needs when it comes to services. So certainly there are efficiencies to be gained, but whether it's the city auditor or the independent budget analyst, every single time they look at this, they say, while there are efficiencies to be gained, we cannot provide the services needed without additional revenue. Speaking more specifically to the jobs, I'll say a couple things. First, AI isn't fixing potholes. AI is not repairing streetlights. AI is not going to provide the human response that my constituents don't just expect but demand when they have a problem at the city. AI is also not going to help us be competitive, which is a huge problem as an employer. The DeMaio playbook for municipal destruction that this city ran for about a decade led us to where we are today. And it made the city the least competitive employer in the region. And that had devastating consequences. We had staff who the city spent money on to train and to recruit, to hire, to train, who consistently were leaving the city for better work environments. And that doesn't just mean better pay and better retirement benefits, although it does. It also means places where they felt like their work was honored. So, Chris, San Diego cannot be the worst employer in the city and provide folks with the services that folks want. City services are provided by city workers. That does not mean that we should not look for ways to improve efficiency and effectiveness. I don't think that we should be looking to AI to replace jobs. I think that we can look to AI to improve productivity. And those are two different things where we're not necessarily, where everyone wins, rather than a situation where there's winners and losers. And the losers are folks who who work at the city, and the losers are the residents who expect to have some sort of human interaction with their city government.
Thank you.
I have a question on homelessness. Mayor Todd Gloria resists the idea that he's become more hardline over the years, but we can see that only starting with his embrace of the camping ban. What do you think about how his policies have evolved, and what has worked in your view and what hasn't?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll let the mayor speak for the mayor. I'm good enough at my job to know to do that. But I'll speak to some of the policies that have been passed. No doubt, the encampment ban represented a crackdown on homelessness, and that's just a reality. It's in the body of the text. I opposed that, and I oppose that because in all of my homework that I've done on this topic for over a decade now, I've never seen a study conducted by folks with credibility on this topic that say that is the way to solve the problem in the city. It is undoubtedly a way to resolve the problem in certain parts of the city. and to potentially move the problem away from certain parts of the city, but not to solve it. So, I think in terms of what we've done that's worked, there's a few things that I'd point to. One, we know that we actually have data that shows that on a monthly basis, the city and as a region, we do a decent job, a pretty good job actually, of moving folks through the system. That the past 2 years, those 700 to 1,200 people per month that have moved out of homelessness and into permanent housing, not into shelter, but into permanent housing, is something that we should be pretty proud of. That requires a lot of work. What we've not done well enough is on the prevention side. We've created programs that are successful. Under my leadership, the council created at the San Diego Housing Commission, the Housing Instability Prevention Program, which is a shallow subsidy program to provide small amounts of money to seniors, to people with families with children and people with disabilities to keep them in their homes. We know that program has been very successful, and we're working to expand it. I've worked with philanthropy to bring additional dollars into supporting seniors and keep them in their homes. We've created the city council, again, acting in our role as the housing authority and through our budget making authority, created a specialized outreach team called a multidisciplinary outreach team, which includes doctors, nurses, social workers, to work with the folks who are most sick on our streets. 85% of the folks who have participated in that program have moved from being the highest, having the highest rate of contact with with law enforcement and our healthcare system, and are now in either shelter or permanent housing. We have to expand these programs, though. And so what I don't think we've done as well as I'd like to see, Tanya, is stick to the plan. I think that we've been distracted at times by things that sound that are going to give us the sugar high of being able to tell voters that we're doing something, because everyone wants to know what we're doing. And it's hard to show some of these things, right? It's hard for them to see it. But when we get distracted by that and we consume a lot of time, energy, conversation, and money on doing that rather than on focusing on the things that are working, we don't make the progress that we can at the rate that we can. The last thing that I will add on that front is I do think that there's something important to be said on the diversity of our shelter options that we now have. My first year in office, during the first half year, I pulled together then Councilmember Kate, Councilmember LaCava, and Councilmember Campillo, and put forth a 4-person memo to the mayor advocating for the expansion of our non-congregate options. Those non-congregate options we've now seen expanded. We have specialized shelter options for people who have specialized needs. Those are our most effective shelter options in terms of moving folks off the streets into shelter and into permanent housing. So we've got a template of programs that work. We just have to lean more into them rather than get distracted by the next shiny object that shows up as a cure-all to our homelessness crisis.
Thank you.
One small follow-up before I move on to the next subject, and that is, if you could just let voters know then, why do we still see people in tents along the freeways? I've been downtown, I've been in different areas of San Diego, and I wouldn't describe it as stepping over people as much as it was before, but I still see plenty of tents up and people still living on the streets. Why do voters still see that?
Yeah, because we haven't done good enough at prevention. It's plain and simple. We've not invested enough in keeping people in their homes. And while the folks that we think about as the examples of homelessness are often the folks who are most unwell, they are not the majority of people who are experiencing homelessness in our city. It's a statewide study that was conducted on homelessness in California demonstrated that about 85% of people who become homeless for financial circumstances. We know that seniors, both in San Diego and across the state, are the group of people who are becoming homeless at the fastest growing rate, which speaks to the financial circumstances that are driving most people into homelessness. And the senior piece is, I think, really important for us to keep our minds on. Seniors are disproportionately likely to be on fixed incomes. and fixed incomes don't keep up with the cost of living increases that we've seen over the last few years. That's why programs like our shallow subsidy program, the housing instability prevention program that I mentioned, and the adjacent program that I helped establish with philanthropy called Seniors Safe at Home is so important. That $250 or $500 or $750 a month keeps people housed. And when we invest in that and we scale up the prevention work that we've already done that has proven successful, we will start to see fewer people in our shelters and on our streets. But until we get better at prevention, we are going to continue to chase our tails. I'm not okay with that. That's why I lean so heavily into the prevention side of the conversation. There's not a lot of stuff that I'll take credit for, Laura, but the prevention piece of being the champion of prevention on city council, I've got colleagues who've supported me on that, but I absolutely, from the time I began, have been championing prevention. I led the effort to get it funded. That was a council created program. We put it in the budget, in the final budget motion in 2022. And I think that's important to note, that we've done things that do work. We just need to do more of those things. And again, the distractions where we spend enormous amounts of money on things that have not been proven, keep us on the treadmill that this city's been on for, quite frankly, decades when it comes to people living on our streets.
I'll move on. Thank you for that. I'll move on to housing. In the opening statement, you said you were doing some things to help lower cost of housing. I'm wondering if you could expand on that just a little bit and tell us exactly what you were talking about. And then the second part of my question is, the mayor can cite an 18-year high in housing starts, but there's also a budding revolt in this city against ADUs in some neighborhoods. Do you agree with that? Or is nobody going to be happy with it, changes no matter what they are?
Yeah, thanks. So first, with respect to housing costs, I will tell you that cost of living in general is my number one priority for my second term. That is the thing that is really threatening the future of this city in a very tangible way and in a big picture way as well. The students that I work with at San Diego State who are involved in the campaign or work in my office, very, very few of them see a future for themselves in the city. I asked a class of about 60 students, third and fourth year students, a few weeks ago, how many of them were confident that they would be able to afford to live in San Diego when they graduate. And 4 people raised their hand. And that class included at least half who'd grown up in San Diego. That is absolutely devastating when we think about the future of this city. And that was largely related to housing costs, cost of living in general, but housing costs. Supply and demand is real. That's a real factor in determining the cost of housing. And we underbuilt for a very long time in San Diego and in California. And absent additional supply, we will continue to see the situation that we're in. That does not mean that supply will fix it all. We also need to take additional measures. The tenant protection ordinance that I led on last year is an example of how we do that. So primarily that was about keeping people in their homes, right? Law-abiding residents who paid their rent on time, abided by the terms of their lease, and were being evicted through what are referred to as no-fault evictions. Absolutely the sort of thing that San Diegans should not be living in fear of. If you pay your rent on time, you follow the terms of your lease, you shouldn't be worried about getting evicted from your home. And that was happening a lot. The second piece of that, which was actually quite important, was turning over the rental market much faster than it should. And that turnover leads to accelerating rental costs that folks just couldn't keep up with. So between the additional supply and the slower turnover, we've seen a flattening of rental housing increases. And I think that's important to note. That does not mean that it's affordable. I want to make that clear. I'm a renter still. There is almost no affordable housing in San Diego unless you are living in a deed restricted affordable home, and with very, very few exceptions. So we are building more. And yes, Laura, part of that are ADUs and our ADU policy, which is objectively successful in terms of producing housing units. Now, I also recognize that change is hard. My district is the epicenter of that ADU conversation. The college area, Talmadge in particular. And I recognize that the change is challenging, and I will not for a second dismiss that there are impacts on folks who've lived in neighborhoods for a long time. So what I've really tried to do is have conversations with constituents about what they need in their neighborhood to absorb the added homes, the added number of people that will be living there. What additional amenities, what additional resources, and the constituents who are willing to engage in that conversation. I think we've had productive conversations. Unfortunately, there's another group, which my opponent has, decided that that's the side he wants to capitalize on. That rather than be future focused and solution oriented, says that we either have to keep things exactly as they are today or rewind the clock. And that's simply not an option for San Diego. I can't look myself in the mirror of a leader in this city knowing that young people don't see a future for themselves here. Young families are considering moving away from their kids' grandparents because they can't afford to live here anymore. And seniors are living terrified that they're either going to end up homeless or have to move away from the only community that they've ever called home. And building more housing is part of that process.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question before we return to the other questions that the board previously talked about? Honestly, for every 2-year election cycle forever, I've asked candidates why don't they support cheaper ways to build housing? And I'm almost sure I asked you about this back in 2020. The fact is you can build a prefab house for $40,000 that meets all safety standards. It's not 1950s, homes that are being blown away. In Britain, hundreds of thousands of such units have been built. In Japan, hundreds of thousands of such units have been built. In the more affluent nations of Africa, hundreds of thousands of such units have been built. The idea that this is an insoluble problem is not reflecting of the fact it's an insoluble problem because of the politics. Building trade unions have blocked every single attempt to bring prefab housing in a significant way to California. And so you are a part of the Democratic coalition that includes building trade unions. So I just have to say, from someone who pulls back and looks at the big picture, this is a choice by California's politicians to not pursue something that's worked so well elsewhere. So what do you say about the abject failure of California to bring in cheaper housing, even as it succeeds around the world?
Yeah, Chris, I agreed with you in 2020, and I still agree with you that this is an option that we should lean more into. I will note that there are two prefab or factory-built housing developments in my district. One of them, which provides affordable housing and created quite a bit of pushback, but was providing critical housing to folks who have a critical need. And the other project is in Stockton in the southern part of my district. So I'm all for us pursuing this. And Chris, I'm not going to deny that there's a struggle for folks to ensure that this sort of housing would not mean displacement from jobs. But what I also am is I am insistent on being solution oriented. And so what I've asked is for leaders in the construction labor unions to have conversations with me and with others about what it would take to make them part of the puzzle. Because there's nothing that says, Chris, that a factory built home those can't be union jobs. We've seen models in the Bay Area, actually, which we would never point to as a place to look for affordable housing. But there is a factory up there that's developed a partnership with the carpenters up there. And I believe, if I recall, had expanded that partnership to include the building trades as well. So I wholeheartedly agree that we have to look for options to bring down the cost of housing. What I would say is that the $40,000 example, that typically is a standalone home, right? That we're not talking about the more multifamily developments, which have a lot of additional regulatory burdens as well. But look, anything that we can do to bring down costs, I think that we should be looking at. There is not a time that I have a long, in-depth conversation with even my closest friends in the labor movement where I don't mention cost as something that we have to be continuously keeping in mind. I don't think that it has to be zero sum, and I will continue to pursue options like prefab and factory built housing that can be produced on scale and done so in a way that respects the honor and dignity of the work that needs to be done to build those homes.
Thanks.
We're going to move on to, we have a number of other questions. I think there might be some misconception that the sewage crisis is South Bay, it's Chula Vista, it's, another city, but that is absolutely not true. It is part of San Diego, some of those areas that have been affected. So I wanted to know how you feel about the federal and state response to the sewage crisis. Should the Biden and Newsom administrations have done more instead of seeing this, our nightmare that we're living, as not qualifying as a federal emergency? And what else could and should the city council be doing, you particularly, to help the situation that has just been going on for way too long?
Yeah, well, last week, as I'm sure you know, Laura, we passed a resolution under the leadership of Councilmember Moreno to call additional attention to the problem, to call on our federal leaders to do more. Every month, we renew the state of emergency. That's been over 30 years that we've been doing that. As I pulled no punches last week when I spoke about this. We had young adults in council chambers speaking on behalf of their communities, asking for change, who've never known a day of their lives when they have not been impacted by this problem. And as I said then, and I'll say again, that to me demonstrates a disregard for the importance of the lives of folks who live in the impacted communities. So yes, the Biden administration and the Newsom administration, but we can go all the way back to the Clinton administration and name the California governor that has sat in that office since the mid-90s and the president that has sat in the White House since the mid-90s, and all of them could have and should have done more to address this problem. And it is an environmental injustice that I think is completely shameful and is a perfect example of what happens when certain communities are not seen as valuable as others. I refuse to accept that this sort of problem would be allowed to go on for this long in more affluent and, quite frankly, wider parts of this state and the country. So I'm all in on advocating. I do try to support Councilmember Moreno, as she's the council member who represents the constituents most directly impacted by the issue. Councilmember Moreno and I, on our trip to DC in the spring, we sat in a meeting with federal officials talking about the need to address this issue. I will continue to support our efforts to call on our federal officials to do more, and I think that we need to appreciate those who have stepped up and shown some leadership. I think Congressman Peters has done a good job of trying to bring together a bipartisan coalition to address this issue. But obviously more needs to be done. And at the council level, we can't fix it on our own. We have to, I think this is one of those places where we have to be strong advocates, and we'll continue advocating.
I think there's some voters that feel like that's not enough, though. And my question is, and that's good to hear that you were, talking with federal leaders and people that can make a better difference. Have you reached out to national media? Because local media can only do so much. We've been writing editorials about this issue over and over and over. I'm surprised people haven't written to us and said enough, but it's such an important issue. I feel like if it hadn't reached the Navy SEALs or Coronado, we still probably wouldn't hear as much as we have. So have you reached out to national media, and, is a resolution enough?
Well, I have not personally, and my team has not personally reached out to national media, although I'd be all for supporting efforts to do that. I think that's fair. That's a fair question to ask. No, a resolution is not enough, but I also think it's important to recognize where our powers, lie. And in this case, look, I wish we had the string to pull to fix this. As much as it'd be a huge problem for us to solve, I'd prefer to be in the situation where we could actually solve for it on our own. We're not in that position. And so it also is important, Laura, always to me, especially when we're talking to communities that have been historically underrepresented and underinvested in, that we do not create false expectations. That is one of the most important things to me. And in the district that I represent, which is the most diverse in the city and has communities that have done an incredible job of advocating for themselves in the past, and are very, very well represented at the polls, and have influential members of the community that live within them, and then others that have been historically just unseen and disregarded by the city. Those conversations with the southern part of my district in particular, I cannot tell you how sacred I hold the responsibility to not create false expectations, to level with them about what we can and can't fix, and what we're going to have to advocate for together in order to create change. Because when folks have been given every reason not to trust government, I will not give them the impression that I can fix something for them that they deserve to have fixed, but that I cannot fix on my own. So it is a totally fair question, but I just want you to know that part of why I am so measured in my advocacy on this is that I do not want to give a resident who's impacted by this the false impression that the city of San Diego, the city council, or myself can be the person that comes and saves the day here.
Thank you. And I understand that that's not directly your district. So I just want to make that clear.
I just want to jump in and say we have another candidate interview at 11 o'clock. So we really need to wrap this up at 10:55. And we still have 3 questions we'd like to ask. So if we could ask the councilman to give us fairly brief answers, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
For sure.
Thanks, Chris. I have a question about police reforms. Maybe it's because crime remains relatively low in the city, but police reforms like homelessness are an issue where many activists feel like City Hall is no longer in their corner. Councilman Henry Foster made some very poignant comments to the editorial board last year when we met with him as a candidate. What is your view?
Tanya, can I ask you my view on reforms, on my view on policing in general?
On whether this is an issue that City Hall used to care about a lot more than it seems to now, just like homelessness.
Yeah. Well, I feel like there's definitely less conversation in general. There's less energy behind the advocacy. I think I've been very consistent, extremely consistent since the time I ran until now about what my expectations are, what my view of safety is, that it's a universal need and a subjective feeling, that it requires us having much more nuanced and mature conversations about the different ways that policing does or does not make a community feel more safe, and all the other things that go into making a community feel safe. So yes, I would agree that generally speaking, there is less focus on reform than there had been in the past. And I would say that, speaking for myself, my values have not changed on this. My positions have not changed on this. I've been extremely consistent in the positions that I put forward and the questions that I've asked, including asking our incoming police chief how we can do better to offset some of the workload that our officers currently face. And I'm until I'm given data or evidence to show that those should not be my positions, I won't change on that.
Thank you. And you just mentioned District 9 includes some of the most diverse neighborhoods in the city. What would be your message to those residents of the district who cannot participate in the election?
Yeah, I thank you, Tanya, because you're the first person who's asked me that question. And that's actually been extremely, being totally honest, a very frustrating part of this cycle. The The majority of my district is renters. The majority of my district lives below the median income level. And a very important part of my district is not able to vote because they are immigrants or refugees. But they are part of the district. They are a core part of the district. And so just as I did when I was an organizer before I became a council member, I worked with those community members to talk to their family members and friends and neighbors who can vote and tell them why this election matters to them. We do not forget those folks in my office. My council office, as far as I've been told, was the most representative that District 9 had ever seen, that the mid-city communities had ever seen. Our ability to not just speak to them in the languages that they speak, but share experiences of coming from immigrant and refugee households has been critical in building and forging relationships that didn't exist between those communities and City Hall prior to our term. So we're going to keep that work going, and it's super important that our non-voting communities engage with those in their communities who can, and make sure that they know that those votes count, 2, 3, 5 times as much because they're speaking for entire families when they cast their ballot.
Thank you.
You've had a contentious relationship with City Attorney Mara Elliott. She didn't care for your second guessing of her opinions and attempts to limit her clout. And she said that she saw some of the criticism as personal, and at least some of your council colleagues agreed with her general criticism, if or not her specific policy views. Why do you think this happened? Do you regret anything that happened?
Well, the why, Chris, I want the council to be a strong council. And it is really important for us to have the ability to bring policy forward on the merits of the policy without it being diluted ahead of time, or without the mayor's office sometimes having a heads up that the policy is coming. So it comes from that desire to see the council carry as much weight and power as possible from the legislative perspective. I absolutely regret that in that debate, it felt personal, but it wasn't. I've had the same conversations with my friends for as long as I've understood the city attorney's office. In my mind, it is impossible to simultaneously do two things at once intellectually, to be focused on mitigating liability for the city and analyzing policy for the merits of the policy goals. You can do one or the other. You can do them one first and then the other one second, but you can't do them at the same time. And the council, my advocacy was about allowing the council to develop policy with a policy lens first, and obviously having to take into consideration liability and other factors that we should, but to not have that be on the front end of our policymaking process in the way that it is now. So, Chris, it is really nothing more than a philosophy about what representation looks like for a council. We are unique in San Diego. I just came back from a convening of council presidents of big cities from across the country. It's the second time I've attended that convening in the last 3 years, and nobody leads a council that has the same sort of structure in terms of representation from council like we do. So I don't want City Attorney Elliott to feel like it's personal. It's not. I just want the council to be as strong as possible, and I think that the conversations that we raised were 100% in that vein.
Quick question: do you support Main Shine?
I did endorse Brian, but I will tell you that I have an excellent working relationship with Heather, and she's provided excellent legal counsel to us on the issues that we've worked with her on.
Thanks.
And just wrapping up, is there anything else that we didn't ask you that you feel that you want to make sure that voters are aware before they cast their ballot?
Well, actually, thank you for the questions that you've asked. I do really appreciate, especially what Tanya asked and about the folks who aren't able to vote. The last thing I will say is this: is that I think context is important. And we started our term in December of 2020, the absolute deadliest time in the pandemic. That didn't just mean that it was scary time, but it was a really difficult time for us to build the face-to-face relationships that are such an important part of this job. And so I want to continue doing this work because I am driven to make an impact. That's why I did work in organizing and advocacy. I'm proud of a lot of the stuff that we've done. I recognize that we have a long way to go, but I also I want to continue to do this work because over the last couple of years, as we've been able to get back to having in-person conversations, our ability to do that work in community, face-to-face with folks has increased. And it is really incredible to watch folks who've never seen themselves as being represented or heard in City Hall begin to formulate the dreams and visions that they have for their neighborhoods, and for us to get those into budget memos, get those the seeds planted in our budget. And I would love nothing more than to continue that work with my District 9 communities.
Thank you very much, Council President. I appreciate it. We should get this processed. It probably won't be up for a few days, but we will also put up your opponent when we talk to him tomorrow. But thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.